The radio waves carried death across the Pacific on the morning of June 3, 1942, but Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto couldn't hear it coming. His massive combined fleets steamed toward Midway Atoll in radio silence, confident that surprise would deliver the knockout blow against the American Pacific Fleet. What Yamamoto didn't know was that the silence from Midway's radio stations wasn't the calm before his storm. It was the trapdoor closing beneath his feet. Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, surrounded by decoded Japanese messages that painted a clear picture of disaster approaching. The American cryptanalysts had been reading Japanese naval codes since early 1942, and every intercepted transmission confirmed their worst fears and greatest hopes. Operation AIM was coming, and it would either end American resistance in the Pacific or become Japan's greatest naval defeat. The deception began with a simple ruse that would have made Sun Tzu proud. Captain Wilfred Holmes, working with Rochefort's intelligence team, devised a plan to confirm that the mysterious Japanese target, AF, was indeed Midway Atoll. Through secure undersea cable, they instructed Midway's commander to broadcast an uncoded message reporting problems with their water purification system. Within 24 hours, Japanese radio intercepts confirmed that AF was short of fresh water, sealing the island's identity as Yamamoto's primary target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, received this intelligence like a gift from the gods of war. While Yamamoto believed he was orchestrating a surprise attack that would lure the American fleet into a decisive battle on his terms, Nimitz was already positioning his forces for an ambush. The Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown would lie in wait northeast of Midway, invisible to Japanese reconnaissance and ready to strike. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo commanded the Kido Butai, the elite carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried Japan's most experienced pilots and newest aircraft. These same aircrews had swept through the Dutch East Indies, Ceylon, and the Indian Ocean with devastating efficiency. They approached Midway with the confidence of an undefeated force, their radio equipment silent on Yamamoto's orders. But silence, the Japanese commanders learned too late, could be a weapon turned against its wielder. While Nagamo's carriers maintained radio discipline, American listening posts tracked their movements through other means. The Japanese fleet's size made complete concealment impossible, and Yamamoto's insistence on radio silence meant that crucial intelligence gathered by his own reconnaissance units never reached the tactical commanders who needed it most. As dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the stage was set for the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. Nagamo's pilots prepared for what they believed would be another routine bombardment of an American base, unaware that 3 American carrier task forces waited in ambush positions. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor through careful planning and intelligence gathering. But at Midway, their own operational security would become their death sentence. The morning air filled with the roar of aircraft engines as Nagamo launched his first strike against Midway's defenses. 108 bombers and fighters took off from the 4 Japanese carriers, their crews confident in their ability to suppress the island's defenses and prepare the way for invasion. Behind them, reserve aircraft waited on the carrier decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for the expected naval engagement with arriving American ships. The first shots of the Battle of Midway were fired not by guns or bombs, but by the typewriter keys of American cryptanalysts who had been working around the clock since early 1942 to crack Japan's most secret naval codes. In the basement of Pearl Harbor's 14th Naval District headquarters, Commander Joseph Rochefort's team at Station HYPO had achieved what many considered impossible. They had broken into the heart of Japanese naval communications, the intelligence picture that emerged from their painstaking work revealed Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy in devastating detail. Operation A was designed as a complex trap, with the attack on Midway serving as bait to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers and experience would crush American naval power forever. Yamamoto had deployed over 200 ships in multiple task forces, including 8 carriers, 11 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. According to historical records from the National World War II Museum, the United States was aware of Japanese communication codes in early 1942. This intelligence advantage gave Admiral Nimitz the one thing that had been missing since Pearl Harbor time to prepare and position his forces for maximum effect. While Yamamoto's fleet steamed eastward in confident ignorance, American task forces maneuvered into ambush positions northeast of Midway. The Japanese plan depended on achieving surprise and fighting the battle on their terms. But Rochefort's codebreakers had stripped away every advantage except raw numbers. Intelligence intercepts revealed not only the timing and location of the attack, but also the composition of Japanese forces, their intended approach routes, and even details about their aircraft loadouts and tactics. This information flowed directly to Nimitz, who used it to craft a defensive strategy that would turn Yamamoto's strength against him. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, while Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher led Task Force 17 with the damaged but operational Yorktown. These 3 carriers represented virtually all of America's remaining naval aviation strength in the Pacific, and Nimitz was gambling everything on one decisive engagement. The intelligence advantage was so complete that American forces knew more about Japanese dispositions than many of Yamamoto's own subordinate commanders. The psychological impact of this intelligence coup cannot be overstated. American naval aviators launched from their carriers on the morning of June 4th, knowing exactly where to find their targets, while Japanese pilots flew toward what they believed was a lightly defended American outpost. The hunters had become the hunted, though Nagumo's aircrews wouldn't realize their predicament until American dive bombers appeared overhead like avenging angels. Radio discipline, so crucial to Japanese operational security, became a fatal weakness when combined with American signals intelligence capabilities. While Nagumo's carriers maintained communication silence, American listening posts tracked their movements through traffic analysis and direction finding. The absence of Japanese radio chatter became as revealing as intercepted messages, creating a shadow picture of fleet movements that Rochefort's analysts could interpret with deadly accuracy. The deception operation that confirmed Midway as target AF represented the perfect marriage of intelligence and psychological warfare. By tricking the Japanese into revealing their target through their own communication security, American intelligence officers demonstrated a sophistication that would characterize Pacific theater operations for the remainder of the war. The Japanese, so proud of their operational security, had been thoroughly penetrated by an enemy they still considered technologically and intellectually inferior. As the first Japanese strike wave departed from Midway on the morning of June 4th, Vice Admiral Nagumo remained unaware that his every move was being monitored and anticipated by an enemy who knew his plans better than he did. The codebreakers had delivered the Pacific Fleet its greatest victory before the first bomb fell, transforming what should have been Japan's triumph into the opening moves of an elaborate ambush that would shatter the myth of Japanese naval invincibility forever. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, concealed the most dangerous concentration of naval power in Pacific War history as Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo's Kido Butai approached Midway Atoll. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed in perfect formation through calm seas, their flight decks crowded with the finest naval aircraft Japan could produce. At 0430 hours, The first engine coughed to life as mechanics prepared for the opening strike of what Admiral Yamamoto believed would be Japan's greatest naval victory. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the first wave of 108 aircraft toward Midway's defenses, his level bombers and dive bombers escorted by 36 Zero fighters that had dominated every aerial engagement since Pearl Harbor. Strike Force departed in textbook formation, climbing steadily toward their cruising altitude as the sun painted the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, reserve aircraft waited on the carrier decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for the naval engagement that Yamamoto's plan demanded. But 300 miles northeast of Midway, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance's task. Force 16 was already launching its own aircraft in the dim morning light. The Enterprise and Hornet dispatched every available bomber and torpedo plane toward the Japanese carriers, guided by precise navigation coordinates provided by American intelligence. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, these aircrews knew exactly where their targets lay and understood that they were participating in the most crucial naval engagement of the Pacific War. The first indication of American presence came not from aerial reconnaissance but from a lone Catalina flying boat that spotted Nagumo's carriers through broken cloud cover at 0530 hours. The pilot's terse radio report, enemy carriers bearing 320, distance 180 miles, confirmed what American intelligence had predicted and triggered the coordinated response that would determine the battle's outcome. Within minutes, every American aircraft in the area was vectoring toward the Japanese fleet. Nagumo's strike reached Midway at 0630 hours, finding the island's defenses alert and determined, despite being heavily outnumbered. Marine fighters rose from Eastern Island's airstrip to challenge the incoming bombers, while anti-aircraft guns opened fire from concealed positions throughout the atoll. The Japanese achieved their tactical objectives, suppressing most of Midway's defensive installations and destroying fuel dumps, aircraft hangars, and command facilities. But Lieutenant Tominaga's assessment that a second strike was necessary would prove catastrophic. The request for additional attacks on Midway reached Nagumo at 0700 hours, just as American torpedo bombers from Midway were beginning their desperate assault on his carriers. These obsolete Devastator torpedo planes, flown by Marine and Navy pilots who knew they faced almost certain death, pressed their attacks with suicidal courage against overwhelming defensive fire. Most were shot down before reaching their targets. But their sacrifice bought precious time for the more capable aircraft. Approaching from American carriers, Nagumo faced a critical decision that would determine the battle's outcome. His reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship operations. But Tominaga's request suggested that a second strike on Midway might be necessary to complete the island's neutralization. At 0715 hours, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for ground attack, a decision that would leave his fleet vulnerable at the most critical moment of the engagement. The rearming process had barely begun when lookouts aboard the cruiser Tone reported American surface ships to the northeast. The delayed launch of Tone's reconnaissance aircraft, a seemingly minor scheduling problem, had deprived Nagumo of crucial intelligence about American carrier positions until it was too late to matter. The discovery of enemy ships triggered frantic efforts to rearm the reserve aircraft once again, this time with anti-ship weapons. But the complex ordnance handling procedures would require at least an hour to complete. As ammunition handlers struggled to move bombs and torpedoes on the crowded carrier decks, Nagumo's fleet came under attack from every direction simultaneously. The morning sky filled with American aircraft as squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown converged on the Japanese carriers from different angles and altitudes. The elaborate defensive formations that had protected the Kido Butai throughout their Pacific conquests began to dissolve under the pressure of coordinated attacks that stretched Japanese fighter defenses beyond their limits. The radio discipline that Yamamoto had imposed to ensure operational security now became a deadly liability as subordinate commanders struggled to coordinate their responses without revealing their positions or intentions. Critical intelligence about American carrier locations remained trapped within the communication hierarchy, never reaching the tactical commanders who needed it most. The silence that was supposed to deliver victory had become the instrument of Japan's greatest naval defeat. At 0920 hours on June 4, 1942. The Pacific War balanced on a knife's edge 300 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, watching in growing alarm as American torpedo bombers pressed suicidal attacks against his carriers from 3 different directions simultaneously. The morning air thundered with anti-aircraft fire and the roar of diving aircraft as Japan's most experienced pilots fought desperately to defend their floating airfields against an enemy that seemed to appear from everywhere at once. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's torpedo squadron from Enterprise attacked first, followed minutes later by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Hornet Squadron and Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Yorktown Group. These obsolete Devastator torpedo planes, barely capable of 200 miles per hour in level flight, approached their targets through a curtain of defensive fire that few would survive. Waldron's entire squadron of 15 aircraft was destroyed, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle's decisive phase from his position in the water. The heroic sacrifice of the American torpedo bombers seemed to confirm Japanese expectations of victory, but their attacks had accomplished something far more valuable than hitting their intended targets. Zero fighters had descended from high altitude to engage the low-flying torpedo planes, leaving the upper airspace undefended just as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise arrived overhead. The timing was coincidental rather than coordinated, but the tactical result was devastating for Japanese hopes. At 0925 hours, 37 dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attacks on Akagi and Kaga, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown Squadron targeted Soryu. The Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with rearming aircraft and volatile ordnance, presented perfect targets for the American bombers diving from 14,000 feet at nearly vertical angles. Zero fighters, caught at sea level after engaging the torpedo planes, couldn't climb fast enough to intercept the diving attackers. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among aircraft being rearmed for the second Midway strike. The explosion ignited aviation gasoline and triggered secondary detonations among the ordnance scattered across the hangar deck. Within minutes, Japan's premier aircraft carrier was engulfed in flames that would burn for hours before consuming the ship entirely. Nagamo, forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, watched in stunned disbelief as his flagship died beneath him. Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate as multiple bomb hits turned the veteran carrier into a floating inferno. The ships experienced damage control parties. Veterans of countless training exercises and combat operations found themselves overwhelmed by fires that spread faster than they could be contained. Aviation fuel fed the flames while exploding. Ordnance turned the hangar deck into a death trap for hundreds of sailors and aircrews. Caught below decks when the attacks began, Soryu's destruction followed the same tragic pattern as McCluskey's remaining bombers scored direct hits on the carrier's flight deck and island structure. The ship's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, died at his post as fires consumed the vessel from stem to stern. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks within the space of 6 minutes, their experienced aircrews either dead or trapped aboard dying ships. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, assembled over years of careful training and combat experience, was being incinerated in the petroleum, Fires that would burn until the carriers slipped beneath the Pacific surface. Captain Tomio Keiku of Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, immediately launched a retaliatory strike against the American fleet. His aircraft, guided by reports from reconnaissance planes, found and damaged the Yorktown in a display of professional competence that demonstrated what the Japanese might have accomplished with better intelligence and coordination. But Hiryu's lone counterattack, however skillfully executed, couldn't reverse the strategic disaster that had befallen the Kido Butai in those crucial 6 minutes. The radio silence that had concealed Japanese approach movements now prevented effective damage control coordination as burning carriers drifted out of formation, their communication equipment destroyed or abandoned. Yamamoto, steaming toward the battle area with the combined fleet's battleships and support vessels, received fragmentary reports that failed to convey the magnitude of the disaster. His grand strategy, so carefully planned and coordinated, was collapsing faster than his subordinate. Commanders could report their losses. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, the myth of Japanese naval invincibility died in the smoke and flames rising from 3 aircraft carriers that had seemed invincible just hours before. The silence that was supposed to ensure operational security had become the funeral shroud for Japan's most elite naval formation, leaving Admiral Yamamoto to contemplate a defeat so complete that it would reshape the entire Pacific War. The afternoon sun of June 4, 1942, cast long shadows across the oil-slicked waters where Japan's naval supremacy lay dying in columns of black smoke that rose from 3 burning aircraft carriers. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, his flag transferred to the cruiser Nagara after Akagi became uninhabitable, surveyed the wreckage of the most powerful carrier force ever assembled. The Kido Butai, which had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision 6 months earlier, was being consumed by the same petroleum fires that had illuminated American battleships in that earlier surprise attack. Captain Tomio Keiku's Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, had struck back with characteristic determination and skill. His veteran aircrews found and severely damaged the Yorktown, proving that Japanese naval aviation retained its deadly competence even in the face of disaster. But the afternoon counterattack, however professionally executed, represented the final spasm of a mortally wounded force rather than any realistic hope of reversing the morning's catastrophic losses. The tactical situation aboard the burning carriers revealed the full extent of Japanese miscalculation. Akagi's hangar deck had become a blazing tomb for dozens of aircraft caught in the rearming process when McCluskey's dive bombers struck. The decision to change ordnance loads twice during the morning, first from anti-ship to anti-ground weapons, then back to anti-ship armament, had left the carrier's deck spaces crowded with volatile munitions that turned bomb hits into ship killing catastrophes. Damage control efforts aboard Kaga demonstrated both the professionalism of Japanese naval personnel and the hopelessness of their situation. Veteran petty officers led firefighting parties into smoke-filled compartments where aviation gasoline burned at temperatures that melted steel bulkheads. Many died at their posts, following naval traditions that emphasized duty above personal survival, but their sacrifice couldn't save ships designed to launch aircraft, not absorb the punishment of sustained bombing attacks. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto's death aboard Soryu epitomized the tragic nobility of Japan's naval officer corps. The veteran carrier commander refused evacuation orders, choosing to die with his ship rather than survive the destruction of his command. His final radio message, terse report of the carrier's condition, revealed nothing of the personal anguish that must have accompanied the realization that his professional lifetime of preparation had ended in total failure. The intelligence failure that enabled the American ambush became fully apparent as the afternoon progressed and Japanese reconnaissance finally located the remaining American carriers. The Enterprise and Hornet, operating northeast of Midway, exactly where American intelligence had positioned them, had achieved complete tactical surprise, despite being outnumbered by the approaching Japanese fleet. Radio intercepts that should have warned of American carrier movements had been filtered through communication procedures that delayed crucial information until it was tactically useless. Admiral Yamamoto, approaching the battle area with the combined fleet's battle line, faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished naval career. The morning's losses had eliminated Japan's first-line carrier strength and most of its experienced naval aviators, but the combined fleet still possessed overwhelming superiority in battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. A night surface engagement might yet salvage something from the disaster, but it would require accepting additional losses among forces that Japan could no longer replace. The strategic implications of the Midway defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japan's naval construction programs, designed for a defensive war in home waters, couldn't replace the lost carriers or their experienced aircrews within any reasonable time frame. American industrial capacity, fully mobilized for global warfare, would produce dozens of new carriers and thousands of trained pilots over the coming years. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably in America's favor during those 6 minutes when dive bombers transformed the Kido Butai into burning wrecks. Radio discipline, so crucial to the Japanese operational plan, had become a deadly liability as burning carriers drifted out of formation with their communication equipment destroyed or abandoned. Damage reports reached Yamamoto in fragments that failed to convey the magnitude of the disaster until it was too late to mount any effective response. The silence that was supposed to ensure surprise had instead prevented the key coordination necessary for damage control and tactical recovery. As evening approached over the Central Pacific, the dying carriers began their final descents toward the ocean floor, taking with them the trained personnel and institutional experience that had made Japanese naval aviation the most feared force in the Pacific. The battle would continue for another day as Hiryu fought her lonely death struggle, but the strategic outcome had been determined in those crucial morning hours when American dive bombers found their targets undefended by fighters caught at sea level pursuing torpedo planes. The setting sun of June 4, 1942, painted the Pacific waters crimson around the funeral pyres of 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, their steel hulls glowing cherry red from internal fires that consumed everything combustible within their shattered frames. Captain Tomio Kaku's Hiryu, the sole survivor of Vice Admiral Nagumo's once mighty Kido Butai, continued her desperate fight against overwhelming odds as American search planes circled like vultures, waiting for the final act of Japan's greatest naval tragedy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato 300 miles west of the disaster, struggled to comprehend fragmentary radio reports that contradicted everything his operational planning had anticipated. The architect of Pearl Harbor's surprise attack had fallen victim to an even more devastating ambush, orchestrated by an enemy he had consistently underestimated. The combined fleet's radio procedures, designed to maintain operational security, had instead prevented timely damage assessment and tactical coordination, when such coordination might have salvaged something from the catastrophe. The human cost of the morning's destruction became apparent as rescue vessels approached the burning carriers. Akagi's crew, trapped below decks when the hangar fires spread beyond control, had died by the hundreds in temperatures that exceeded the melting point of aluminum aircraft. Many of Japan's most experienced naval aviators perished not in aerial combat, but as helpless victims of petroleum fires that consumed their floating airfield faster than damage control parties could respond. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, the Enterprise Air Group commander whose navigation skills had located the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, landed aboard his ship to discover that his morning's work had fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory. The timing of his attack arriving just as Zero fighters descended to engage American torpedo bombers represented the kind of tactical coordination that military historians would analyze for decades, though it had been achieved through coincidence rather than planning. Radio intercepts revealed the full extent of Japanese confusion as scattered reports reached Yamamoto's flagship throughout the afternoon. The admiral's strict communication discipline had prevented subordinate commanders from sharing intelligence that might have warned of American carrier positions, while the same radio silence now delayed damage reports that could have informed his decision about continuing the operation. The weapon he had wielded so effectively at Pearl Harbor had been turned against him with devastating results. Captain Kaku's final strike from Hiryu, launched against the damaged Yorktown in the early afternoon, demonstrated the professional competence that had made Japanese naval aviation the Pacific's dominant force for 6 months. His pilots executed their attack with the same precision that had characterized the Pearl Harbor raid, proving that individual Japanese skill and determination remained formidable even in the face of strategic disaster. But 36 aircraft couldn't reverse the morning's destruction of over 200 planes and their irreplaceable crews. The decision to scuttle Hiryu came as darkness fell over the Pacific, ending the career of Japan's last operational fleet carrier in the Central Pacific. Captain Kaku chose to go down with his ship, following the same Bushido code that had claimed Captain Yanagimoto aboard Soryu. These deaths represented more than personal tragedy. They eliminated experienced commanders whose tactical knowledge had been developed through years of combat operations that Japan could no longer afford to duplicate. Damage assessment reports reaching Pearl Harbor painted a picture of American victory so complete that Admiral Nimitz initially questioned their accuracy. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed, with the 4th burning and abandoned, represented a reversal of fortune that exceeded the most optimistic American predictions. The intelligence advantage provided by Station HYPO's code-breaking efforts had produced results beyond anything Commander Rochefort's team had dared to hope when they confirmed Midway as the Japanese target. The strategic implications of the Midway defeat rippled through Japanese naval planning as staff officers in Tokyo attempted to comprehend reports of losses that would require years to replace. Japan's naval construction programs, designed for a defensive war close to home waters, lacked the capacity to build new carriers fast enough to maintain parity with American production. The experienced aircrews who had died in the carrier fires represented an investment in training and combat experience that Japanese naval aviation schools couldn't reproduce within any tactically relevant timeframe. As midnight approached over the Central Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto faced the bitter reality that his grand strategy for Pacific dominance had died with the burning carriers. The combined fleet retained overwhelming superiority in battleships and cruisers, but these surface vessels couldn't project power across the vast Pacific distances without carrier-based aviation support. The radio silence that was supposed to ensure operational surprise had instead facilitated the most decisive American naval victory since the Constitution defeated the Guerriere in 1812, transforming Japan's moment of anticipated triumph into the beginning of an inexorable retreat toward the home islands. At the dawn of June 5, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed by 24 hours of naval combat that had fundamentally altered the balance of power between Japan and America. Where Admiral Yamamoto's Kido Butai had steamed toward Midway in confident expectation of victory, only oil slicks and scattered debris marked the graves of 4 aircraft carriers and over 3,000 Japanese naval personnel. The silence that had concealed their approach had become their epitaph, written in smoke columns that rose from the ocean floor where Japan's naval supremacy lay entombed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, studying battle reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, recognized that American forces had achieved something beyond tactical victory. They had broken the spine of Japanese naval aviation and eliminated the trained personnel who constituted Japan's most irreplaceable military asset. The Enterprise, Hornet, and the mortally wounded Yorktown had accomplished what 6 months of defensive fighting had failed to achieve. They had seized the strategic initiative in the Pacific and would never relinquish it. The aftermath of Midway exposed the fundamental weakness in Japanese naval planning that radio silence had both concealed and exacerbated. Admiral Yamamoto's strategy depended on achieving decisive victory in a single engagement, but it made no provision for the extended industrial warfare that American production capacity would wage over the coming years. Japan's naval construction programs could replace the lost carriers within 2 years, but the trained aircrews who died in the petroleum fires would require 5 years to duplicate time that the changing strategic balance would never allow. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's navigation decision to continue searching beyond his planned turning point had located the Japanese carriers at the precise moment when their defensive fighters were engaged at sea level, creating the tactical opportunity that 6 minutes of dive bombing converted into strategic catastrophe. The coincidental timing of American torpedo and dive bomber attacks demonstrated how quickly fortune could reverse in naval aviation combat, where the difference between victory and disaster often measured in minutes rather than hours. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, the Pearl Harbor strike leader who had been hospitalized with appendicitis and missed the Midway operation, later wrote that the battle's outcome hinged on Japanese communication failures as much as American tactical skill. The intelligence that could have warned of American carrier positions existed within the Japanese reconnaissance network, but radio discipline prevented its transmission to the commanders who needed it most. The very security measures designed to ensure surprise had instead guaranteed that surprise would be achieved against Japanese forces. The human dimension of Japan's defeat became apparent in the weeks following the battle as families throughout the home islands learned that husbands, sons, and fathers would never return from what had been promised as the decisive victory that would end American resistance in the Pacific. The experienced pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Indian Ocean were gone forever, taking with them the institutional knowledge and combat experience that had made Japanese naval aviation the Pacific's most feared force. Radio intercepts continued to provide American intelligence with insights into Japanese strategic planning as Tokyo struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the Midway disaster. The same code-breaking capabilities that had enabled the American ambush now revealed Japanese efforts to rebuild their carrier forces and train replacement aircrews, intelligence that would guide American offensive operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The silence that Japan had hoped to maintain about their defeat became impossible as strategic reality forced acknowledgement of losses that couldn't be concealed. Admiral Yamamoto's personal reaction to the Midway defeat reflected the profound psychological impact of a disaster that had eliminated Japan's best hope for victory in a single morning. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood better than most that Japan's only chance for success had depended on achieving decisive results before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. The burning carriers at Midway represented not just tactical losses, but the death of Japan's strategic prospects for victory in the Pacific War. The intelligence revolution that enabled American victory at Midway established patterns of signals interception and code breaking that would characterize Pacific theater operations for the remainder of the war. Commander Rochefort's team at Station HYPO had demonstrated that cryptanalytic capabilities could provide decisive tactical advantages when combined with operational competence and strategic vision. The Japanese never again achieved the kind of operational surprise that had made Pearl Harbor possible, while American forces enjoyed intelligence, advantages that grew progressively more comprehensive. As the war continued. As the waters closed over Hiryu's burned-out hull in the early hours of June 5th, they sealed the tomb of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The radio silence that Admiral Yamamoto had imposed to ensure operational security had instead facilitated the most complete naval defeat in modern warfare, transforming what should have been Japan's greatest victory into the beginning of an irreversible strategic retreat. The echoes of that defeat would reverberate through every subsequent Pacific engagement, a constant reminder that in naval warfare, silence could be the most dangerous weapon of all, especially when wielded by an enemy who had learned to turn it against those who imposed it.